Hi, this is James Jokin with Webcomic Reviews and Interviews. Tonight we're talking about plotting. So sit back, relax, and let the Geek Fest begin. One of the big problems when it comes to writing comics is having to sit back and actually start writing the bloody thing. And yeah, this is where you see a lot of writers start learning how to swear. Straight up. By page 10, your average writer can swear better than a sailor. By page 20, the sailors are backing off, going, dude, get therapy. By page 30, yeah, things are not going to be looking happy. But of course, we push through it and eventually get it done. The key here is that in order to get anything done as far as writing goes, we need to be relatively well organized. I've already mentioned the Bible. You need something where all your information is easily kept and referenced. When we're talking, obviously you're going to be learning how to outline it on your own. I'm going to basically give you some really great tips on how to do some plotting tonight. And then, of course, we'll start looking at a lot of the major details later on. But for now, alright, first off, before we even get going, the obviously book recommends. 2 notes. Well, let me give the recommends and give the general history stuff that's going to bore everybody. Alright, first off, Stan Lee's How to Write Comics. Definitely a must-read book, just simply because Stan Lee had a lot of fun doing the actual writing stuff. Talks about how the Marvel system used to work, how the system works now, looks at script formats, basic plot twists, that kind of fun stuff. Definitely a mandatory read. Scott McCloud's Understanding Comics. Straight up, if you're into comics and you do not have Scott McCloud books in your library, seriously, you really debate your career. I mean, there's a lot of really cool ideas on how to do plots, how to do formats, and generally speaking, how to actually write comics. Some people note that I did not put DC writing comics in here. That's because the DC book is really interesting in terms of how DC does their formats, but they don't really tell you anything of actual interest. It's an interesting book. It's nice to have as part of your library just for reference, but if you can avoid the DC book, do so. I mean, look at it if you can, but, you'll notice I'm being really, really trying to point out that it's a really big debate. Joseph Campbell. Straight up, if you're not up on how the hero's journey works, you need the Joseph Campbell books. Again, it's a must-read. If you're heavy into writing and you're going to find that you're going to do a lot of stumbling around until you've actually read the hero's journey. I just cannot recommend the book enough. There's a reason a lot of people read it and point out it's like the biggest thing they've ever read. Yeah, you're going to find out that a lot of it is stuff you've read in a lot of other places. It's just interesting to see it all put into one basic format and then pretty much explained. And if you're basically trying to do books that escape the standard format, well, you're going to find out real quick that either without that book, you're going to be reinventing the wheel completely by accident a whole lot. So, Hero's Journey, definitely recommend. The other major book to recommend is Save the Cat by Blake Snyder. It's definitely a straight movie writing book, but the entire concept was that Blake Snyder, who's done a lot of really great stuff in terms of screenwriting, I said his slush pile, that is his big pile of unusable scripts, and I do mean unusable. We're talking stuff that sci-fi pictures will never use. And when you know it, we're talking about when we're talking sci-fi movies, we're talking Attack of the Five-Headed Shark movies. So, if we're talking a movie that sci-fi wouldn't use, yeah. Blake Snyder basically went through and decided to do his own book where he basically decided, hey, what is stuff that works in a screenplay, what doesn't, and actually put all this stuff into a really great little book. This is one of those indispensable books that's worth reading at least once. And of course, if you're into any type of role-playing, especially the tabletop stuff, I recommend looking at any of the books that are specifically tailored towards giving game masters and dungeon masters and all that their specific advice on how to create adventures. It may sound counterintuitive, but a lot of people tend to go into gaming with no idea how to tell a basic story. And, well, obviously with a 40-year history, somewhere along the line, somebody got this brilliant idea to say, hey, here's how you write a story. Here's your basic plot development, here's your character development, here's how to put together so you actually works out, and so on and so forth. So in essence, it's storytelling for dummies. If you don't believe me, arguably one of the best books to look for is the 4th edition Champion Superhero Rules. You can pretty much ignore all the basic rules, but what I sort of advise looking at are what they call disadvantages, which actually goes through and lists out the common problems with superheroes. Superman's kryptonite, Batman's psychological issues, so on and so forth, in terms of saying, hey, these are stuff you can actually get points for, but let's look at them. Also, there's a couple chapters in the back of the book that specifically deal with how to set up campaigns, and they look at a lot of the basic superhero tropes. So it's worth looking at just because there's a lot of really great storytelling advice in there. So, recapping just so we're all on the same page. Stan Lee's How to Write Comics, Understanding Comics, Scott McCloud, Save the Cat, Blake Snyder, Joseph Campbell, The Hero's Journey. There's a really great word to set up his interview. If you can find that book, you're doing awesome. And Champion's 4th edition Superhero Rules. If you can start off with those books, you're doing pretty good. I'm also going to throw in, if you can find any of the books from the American Film Institute on how to write a screenplay, look at those as well. Again, these are just books that are really good to sort of get an idea on how to basically do the whole writing thing. So, I guess I better do the quick, boring explanation of screenplay writing, huh? Alright, real quick. The idea behind movies in the first place was to essentially just capture real quick snippets of, what was going on. People kissing, sneezing. The best one yet, period, that I really wish I was in the audience for, was when they actually have a train pulling in. Just because it would be so awesome to see this group of people who have never seen a movie before in their entire life, who have no idea what to expect, all of a sudden have a huge giant train coming right at them. Even if there's no sound, that had to be, there were heart attacks in that audience. But the key here is that originally it was just so, even when we start looking at, say, Lumiere's Man on the Moon, Voyage to the Moon, you don't really see a whole lot of script writing. You just see a lot of individual, quick little scenes that were put together just to see what you could do with film. Well, somewhere between the 1920s and the 1930s, you started getting actual production companies together, and you actually got started people doing this actual writing thing. Originally, they didn't go to the actual playwrights. They went to journalists. They went to people like, obviously they didn't go to Hemingway, but people that wrote like Hemingway. They were looking for people, the detective pulp stories. The reason for this is because a lot of the plays, even though you do have a basic script there's a lot of conventions that aren't. The problem is there's a lot of stuff that works on a play that just simply does not work in a movie. Look at movies like, say, 12 Angry Men, The Locker Room, Chorus Line. There's just way too much talk, not enough action. And when we start looking at movies, we need a lot of that action. It just doesn't. You need people talking, pretty much in snippets. You need some action, and you don't see that in a lot of plays, even the musicals. So, instead of going to playwrights, they went to journalists, and so they took advantage of the journalists, said, "Hey, here's what I want," and let the journalists go for it. who of course at that point would work in conjunction with the director to create something. If you want to see what this looks like, well, obviously the first thing you can do is track down a lot of the old black and white movies. The other thing you can do is start tracking down Hong Kong movies. The martial arts movies, besides being a whole lot of fun to watch, are pretty much still in the old Hollywood frame of mind. You know, real short dialogue, lots of action, real basic plot. I mean, it's not real serious filmmaking, generally speaking. I mean, yeah, you've got some really great stuff out there, but in terms of actual writing, if all honesty, if I was going to say it, I'd almost say I really like American storytelling. But, even though I know how heretical that's got to sound. But, for our purposes, that's screenplay writing in its nutshell. You know, now we're basically looking at, you know, a lot of people look at the real basic camera angles, what's basically happening, and all of this has to be described. So again, if you can look at a lot of the screenplays, it's not necessarily a bad idea to look at how these are set up, and then realize that you'll be doing an entirely different format. But you're looking more at plot structure. So, when it comes to plot structure, you're going to have essentially three separate types of comics. You're going to have the single-page gag comic, your weeklies, and then your long form. Notice that I'm saying single-page gag comics. If you're heavy into comics, you know that it's generally called a single-panel gag comics. We're looking at Family Circus, Bizarro, Far Side. You know, you're looking at basically a single panel, does a really quick joke, has a lot of fun. However, somewhere along the line, we also got stuff that's essentially single gag, but it had a whole lot of panels. The webcomic version of this is that really great Gutters comic, which essentially is a superhero riff. It sounds a little weird, but the entire concept is that each one of these single pages is essentially its own universe. That is, you may see characters get recycled. We know what a Far Side cow looks like, a Far Side scientist, a Far Side chicken looks like, but you don't see a whole lot of character development of those characters in terms of the comic. Gutters, same basic concept. You see a lot of the same characters get a lot of recycled, but you don't see those characters really develop, and there's not a whole lot of plot development past that little page. So each one of these pages and panels exists in pretty much its own little universe. That's cool. If you're going to do that, then obviously a lot of what I'm going to say won't apply to you. Obviously, the next step will be the weeklies. Weeklies is, you know, you see this all the time. Doonesbury, Dilbert. Webcomics wise, I seriously advise checking out Penny Arcade and The Company Man. The basic concept is, come Monday, you introduce a problem, let it fester and develop over the next couple of days, and then Friday or Saturday solve it. And there's not a whole lot of long-term character development. Get wrong, there's a lot, especially if you have a comic that's been around for decades. Look at what's going on with Doonesbury. You know, you had Mike start off in college, have a couple of love lives. He's gotten married, he's had a kid, he's had a divorce, he's found another love, he's had a career. So you can't really say there's not a whole lot of character development. It's just more of a natural evolution type of thing than it is actually planned, you know? It's just stuff that happens. I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that, but when we start looking at webcomics, some really good examples are PvP with Scott Kurtz. You know, at one point, you actually had two of the characters actually level up, which is great because it's a gaming comic. But, you know, the characters had entirely different character designs. They gained motivations. They had an entirely new set of problems. You've also had characters within the comic get older visibly. You've had the company change hands. You've had it evolve. You've had it get bigger. You had Brent and Jade actually have a interesting little evolving relationship. You know? So obviously with a weekly, you're going to have plot and long-term character development, but generally speaking, it's just part of the evolution of the comic. It's not something that was actually planned all the way back on day one. Not usually. You're always going to have those idiots that are going to prove me wrong. So I'm going to beat you to the punch and say, yes, you can plan that stuff ahead of time, but generally speaking, it's going to happen more over time than it's going to be planned from the beginning. What we're interested in is the long form, the epics, the oh my gosh, I can't believe how long this thing is. We're not looking at, say, even what I guess you call an extended weekly, like, say, Sluggy Freelance or Mega Tokyo, where they haven't, instead of having a weekly setup, they're set up as a monthly, where the entire story arc lasts the entire month, and then they usually go to something different. We're talking, all for lack of a better phrasing, we're looking at Lord of the Rings type of stuff. That is, this is something that's going to be ongoing for, at least 6 months to several years, possibly longer. Not that there's anything wrong with that. In fact, that's sort of cool. There's some really cool stuff out there. All I can suggest is probably look at... The problem I'm having with recommending is that with Gutters, as a single-page gag comic, it's pretty easy to say, hey, everybody's going to love it because they have enough general information, enough general riffs of the superhero stuff that actually is plenty for everybody. Penny Arcade is a gaming comic, same as PvP, but they also tend to deal... But anytime you deal with a single-page gag comic or a weekly, you're generally looking at stuff that, even though it's set up for a specific situation, there's enough universal stuff in it that usually, everybody gets a laugh at it. When we start looking at the epics, we start getting stuff like Cerebus, the story of an aardvark from birth to his death, 300 issues later. We're not talking a superhero comic where it's, even though it's divided into story arcs, it can last like decades. Just look how long Superman's been around. But it's still going to be more episodic over time. They'll have 2 or 3 comics, maybe in a storyline that lasts a couple of months. But generally, we're talking the same basic rule of the continuity of the weekly. There's going to be some character growth and plot development over time, but it's going to happen as a natural evolution rather than something that was actually really, really planned for. We're talking more like, obviously, we're talking more like Lord of the Rings type of stuff here, where there's some really interesting world building and it goes up from there. We're talking, all I can say is look up Pamela Harrison. Incredible writer. Zillia. ZYlia. There's some really fun stuff out there that's actually worth looking into. So, but for our purposes, I'll probably be referring a lot to Lord of the Rings because everybody's familiar with it. So, and for the record, I'll probably be slipping between a lot of talking a lot of movie scripts and a lot of comic scripts. That's fine because there's a lot in common between the two. So, deal with it. I'm letting you know right off the bat, it's going to be a common error. My apologies in advance, but that's all you're getting. When we start looking at long form, when it's not epic, it's long form, we start looking at variations on the 3-act structure. The real quick, everything builds up, something happens, the instigating incident, then it builds up again to the climax, and then everything after that is pretty much denouement. So, let's get into it. First off, understand that when we talk 3-act structure, it doesn't have to be just 3 acts. You want to do a 5, 7, 9 act, go for it. Nothing's holding you back in that regard. But do try to keep it at an odd number. Yeah, you've had people do 4 and 6 act scripts. Yeah, it doesn't work out as well as they think. They think they're going to do something really cool, and then by the end of it, it just, don't do it. I'll be nice. Try to keep it to the standard odd numbers. what you're going to need to do is figure out if you want the first major decision is how you want this thing to end. Do you want it to be on a positive note or on a negative note? Because if you want to end up on a positive note, your first act will sell it. Same as if you want to end on a negative note. So if you're trying to do some sort of dystopian, dark comedy type of deal, and you want to go on a negative, cool. If, on the other hand, you want to do the, end on some sort of positive, cheerful note, that's cool too. I don't really care. But I am going to show you how to get there. And the way you do it is if you want to do it end on a positive note, the default structure you're going to use, this is the basic 3 acts, are going to be your first act is going to be building a lot of positive stuff until something really horrible happens. Then you're going to have a long chain of bad stuff until something turns it all around. This is what we call the climax. After that, everything basically starts fitting into place. Until by the end of the comic, you've got bad guys have been defeated, the good guys have gotten their rewards, and the world is a better place. Or, at least it didn't blow up. On the other hand, if you want to go negative, just switch it around. That is, have all sorts of bad stuff happen until they win the lottery or something really cool, positive happens. It's a lot more positive, and then all of a sudden something really horrendous happens and everything starts falling apart. Sort of like your old movie westerns. And if you think I'm kidding, how many westerns, if you really want check some fun stuff out, your average movie western is pretty much, guy comes to town, is having a really bad day, his day gets worse, his horse gets shot, he finds out he's got a $500 reward at him, some young punk's trying to kill him, and then all of a sudden he shoots the sheriff, and it turns out the sheriff was a really corrupt guy, so the guy having a really bad day all of a sudden has a job. He starts getting popularity with a schoolmarm. The reward? He gets pardoned. He doesn't just get one really cool horse, he gets a whole fleet, and hey, he even gets a wrench out of it. And then, of course, somebody finds out really bad secret from his past, finds out who he actually is, and, well, at that point, he has to give up the job. He has to run from everybody, and there's about a 50-50 shot of him dying by the end of the movie. That's your basic negative downer plot. This also applies to your dystopians and your dark comedies. So if you start saying that, hey, nobody ever ends on a negative note, dude, read, watch, pay attention. But the only thing you need to realize is that there's 2 scenes that are really important here. That's at the end of your first act, you need the instigating incident. This is the incident that basically gets everybody going on what they're supposed to be doing. Lord of the Rings, obviously the major incident is when the fellowship gets sundered. The first act is essentially everybody gets, Gandalf makes sure Frodo has the ring, sends him off with 3 other friends. They have a couple of adventures, but every time there's something bad's about to happen, they get rescued, or it turns out it was just somebody messing with them. Until, of course, they make the cross into Rivendell, where they get rescued by Elrond, and, by the water horses, and then they end up in Rivendell. They have this really cool conversation. Everybody's given all this really cool equipment, etc. They set out, and Boromir screws up. He decides he decides that he needs the ring more than some weak little hobbit, aka the football. So he tries to make a move for the ring. And of course it doesn't end up as well, because at that point not only does he totally mess up how he's doing it, but everybody gets attacked by the orcs. Boromir ends up with 51 arrows in his chest, and everybody else just scatters to the winds. So, the big incident that set everything up was obviously the sunder of the fellowship. And when you start analyzing a lot of screenplays, you'll notice that there's a lot of stuff that happens around the same place in every act, or the end of the first act. It's just part of the structure. And then, of course, throughout, you see, the problem is Lord of the Rings is pretty much a bad example of this because it ends up being a little bit more than a 3-act play. But then all of a sudden, a lot of bad stuff starts happening, you know? Frodo and Samwise have problems getting into, you know, wherever they're trying to Mordor. There's a time when Frodo gets sick, they find Gollum and have to deal with his nonsense, etc., etc. You've got Pippin and Merry have to deal with the sermon stuff, and of course you've got Aragorn, Gimli, and Legolas have to deal with all of their stuff, but it turns out being a lot of negative because even though they're getting allies and all that together, they're also having to deal with a lot of soap opera stuff. And the soap opera stuff just starts getting bloody annoying. And I don't mean just for us, but for them as well, because they find out it's not as easy as they think. They've got an insane king out there. You've got the person in charge of Minas Tirith who's trying to do his own little thing, you know. And of course you've got Gandalf flitting everywhere and trying to make sure everything keeps steady. So, you know, there's a whole lot of mess in that second act that's generally overall not exactly what you'd call fun times. Then, of course, everything starts getting together right about the time of the big battle. And I mean the one over in Gondor, not the cool one over at Helm's Deep. You know? You got everybody pulling together. Everybody's figuring out, hey, if we can get together, we can kick some butt. So on and so forth. And then all of a sudden, the insane king gets replaced by, I'm going to want to say his daughter, but don't quote me on that. It's been a while. It's been at least 6 months. You know, Aragorn actually ends up taking over, and they actually figure out a way to get the frigging ring off to Mountain Doom and toss it and get rid of Gollum. You know, that's your third act. The climax here is essentially when they get everybody together in Gondor. Well, almost everybody. So, and of course, ends up with a lot of people heading out, you know, the Fourth Age of Man starting up. So, you know, that when it comes down to is Lord of the Rings in a nutshell. So, and more importantly, I've just described what's called the A-plot, the main through line, the big main plot. For our purposes, though, we're going to call it the A-plot. The A-plot is the one you actually worry about. You're going to have subplots, you're going to have running gags, but, you know, for the main plot is pretty obvious. That's where all of your main stuff happens. The important stuff, as it were. Obviously, it's going to have your instigating incident. That's where things turn around. You know, using something really good is going to happen or something really bad is going to happen. It's going to be a counterpoint to the entire first act. Send you in spiraling or climbing into the second act, which will end with a climax. The climax is the big event that, you know, sets everything off. It either pulls everything together or it tears everything apart. After that, it's what's called the denouement. In essence, let's just see how everything plays out, throw a little bit of the rewards or the penalties, and let it go with that. Sometimes you'll see as the denouement is really, really short. Star Wars, classic example. You know, you've got everything's really going bad for the rebel bases. It's about to be blown up. They can't figure out what to do because all their ships are being blown up. And then all of a sudden, they hit this climax where Luke basically does a 3-point shot, destroys the Death Star, and then 10 minutes later the credits roll. You know, classic short denouement. So, that, when it comes down to it, is a 3-act structure in a nutshell. You know, you've got your main plot, which is going to describe all your major beats. You know, you're going to define what's important to the plot, and Everything else is going to more or less, well, not everything else. Like I said, we're going to have subplots. We'll get to those in a sec. Trust me. In fact, we'll be talking about them a lot longer than we build the main plot. But your A plot is essentially all of your important events. You know, if you were to do a history of the movie, of your comic, these would be the ones that all the historians pretty much are the ones that are going to be talking about it. You know, did it quite happen this way? Was this person here? Wasn't that person there? Why was that person not there? These are the stuff that if you had historians in your comic, these are the big events that everybody would be looking at. On the other hand, then you're going to have your B plots, aka the subplots, better known as the moments the fans remember. I mean, sure, everybody remembers the big battles at Helm's Deep. You know, they remember the big thing, you know, the 3-point, the torpedo down the mine shaft type of deal. Well, not mine shaft, but, you know, you get the idea. You know, everybody remembers the big details. That's your A plot. Your B plot are where things get to have a little bit of fun. Obviously, these are where you're going to have these are where you're going to have all your romantic stuff going on. You're going to have some of your character development here. You know, if you're basically looking at this as your standard RPG, these are your side quests. Luckily, you don't have to worry too much about grinding unless you really want to, but generally speaking, these are the stuff that doesn't really matter. You can totally chop off. And yeah, everybody'd miss them, but they're not really all that important to the main plot. I mean, sure, you may find that item you need over in the set. See, here's where it's going to get fun. If it's an important item for the plot, then it's going to be part of the main plot. On the other hand, if it's an item that's only important to one or two characters, you know, then we're talking a subplot. And pretty much everything else is divided the same way. If you can include it, if you deleted that particular scene and it affects the main plot, obviously it's not a subplot scene. It's a main plot scene. The main plot is where you're going to hit all your major symbolism points. It's where you're going to have if you were looking at this in terms of the hero's journey, if it applies to one of the beats of the hero's journey, it's a main plot. Everything else is a subplot. You know, you've got the will they won't they couple subplot. You've got the guy who has to return home to grab a necklace just because it looks really shiny or it gives him a particular bonus, but only him. Yeah, it might help him later on and defeat the bad guy, but actually no, sorry. If it helps him defeat the bad guy, well, that little quest of his just became a main plot, or part of that main plot. If, on the other hand, it only gives him a bonus and it only allows him to kill off a minion, hey, you've got a subplot. The basic difference is, like I said, all of your main action is going to happen over your main plot, the A plot. Your B plots are going to be more of, see, if it develops a plot, main plot. If it develops a character, it's a B plot, the subplots. Have I totally confused you yet? Good. The B plots, or the subplots, are going to be where you start dealing with the romantics, when you start doing the character development stuff. You know, the heroes have some psychological flaws that you need to deal with. You know, well, when he goes and saves the orphanage, that's probably part of the B plot. The key here is that these plots tend to be, even though they're not quite as metaphorical as stuff that happens in the main plot, they do have their own little cool little things going on. You know, these are stuff that really great for the fans. That is, whereas the main plot serves the general audience, when you start looking at a little bit of the more world building, character development, romance type stuff, that's going to be more of a subplot or a B plot. Generally speaking, you're going to have 2 or 3 of these running around. You know, if we're looking at, say, again, going over to Lord of the Rings, to a certain degree, the Merry and Pippin thing over in Isengard with Sir Herman, generally speaking, that's a subplot. You know, you've got really cool things happening with Merry and Pippin, even though they do find out some really important stuff later on. generally speaking, it's pretty much all subplot. Important stuff, yeah, but it's more all of that's, building up stuff for those particular characters, and it's more fan stuff than anything else. Anything pretty much that happens with Frodo and Samwise, main plot. Again, you're building up stuff for what's going to end up happening with the One Ring, and the One Ring is basically the MacGuffin that sets everything else off. So that's how that boils down. On the other hand, all the stuff that happens with Aragorn, Legolas, and Gimli, I want to say Gimli. Again, subplot. You got some really cool character building stuff because it's starting to build up Aragorn, who's going to be taking over as the king. And they need him set up as the king by the end of the movie. So, anything that happens with those three characters is pretty much a subplot. There are a few exceptions here and there, but, you can pretty much cut out anything that happens to do with anybody but Frodo and Samwise, and the rest of it, and, it doesn't really matter. It's cool stuff that happens, but it's not really all that important. Not to the main plot, anyway. You see where I'm sort of going with? Important to main plot? Main plot. Stuff that can be easily cut off and nobody will miss it? Subplot. However, let's complicate this by having good old C plots. These are things that are, for lacking a better phrasing, returning metaphors. They're just stuff that keeps popping up. That's sort of cool, but doesn't really, doesn't necessarily have to have its own little plot line. It can actually be a series of scenes, that have pretty much nothing to get together, but they do tend to have a little bit of a running, some sort of theme. Again, Lord of the Rings, the Legolas Gimli type of little thing where they trying to keep, doing a little bit better than the other with the archery contest, and the whole, that only counts as one. That thing, that's a straightforward running gag. It's fun. It adds a little bit to the story, but let's get real. It's completely extraneous. If you have a character who keeps going off and trying to get drunk or get laid, again, running gag. Character trying to get rid of his virginity, and we're not talking as a teen sex company. Yeah, at that point, we're still talking running gag. The classic example, as far as I'm concerned, is from the movie Action Jackson. Because from the beginning of the movie up till the climax, they've got this one kid that, every time he involves himself with the police, they usually point out that, oh yeah, wait till he meets Action Jackson, then he'll be totally screwed. This, of course, culminates when he actually does meet Action Jackson and faints. At that point, we're about to hit the climax. It's time we get rid of the running gags. And let's get into the actual movie itself. Or at that point, it's just, we're looking. If you can see Action Jackson, go for it. It's a really great movie. I'm not going to say it's an Oscar winner by any stretch of the imagination, but it's just one of those fun movies that's sort of fun to watch. And it's got pretty much everything you'd want in a movie. It's got some solid plot, solid character development, and of course, a running gag that rocks. But you can also set up as a group of individual teams with some sort of theme to them. If you're trying to show that everybody has something they're fighting for, look at the movie Armageddon. At various parts of, you've got that one, right before everybody takes off, you've got where everybody goes out and they show you what they're fighting for. But you've also had that expressed throughout the entire movie, You've got, some of the characters have been talking back and forth to the homes. And so so you've got showing them, dealing with their family stuff, saying goodbye to their families, and at the end of the movie, they're celebrating with the family. Technically, that counts as a C plot. Totally extraneous, but it builds up on the movie. When we start looking at comics, you've got the dreaded Parker Luck, where Spider-Man cannot get a break to, save his life. Obviously that's changed in the last couple of years, but the Parker Luck is definitely worth looking into. You've got Superman and his secret identity problems. Even when we start looking at, say, Jimmy Olsen, they keep coming back and forth with mentioning stuff that's happened in his past. Turtle Boy, classic example. They've had a lot of really cool little running gags with Jimmy Olsen. In webcomics, you've got situations that keep showing up. Sluggy Freelance, you've got Torg's incompetence. Sometimes it'll just show up as in somebody will mention something that happened from his way past. And it won't have a payoff for another couple of installments where they actually show what he actually did, and it's hilarious. Again, stuff that's totally extraneous to the main plot is a running gag or a C plot. Notice how we got that cute little hierarchy there? Main plot is your A plot. Your important subplots, B plots. Anything else? C plot. See how hard that is? So, when it comes down to your plot, you're going to want to set it up as a 3-act structure. It's going to have, if you want to have it in negatively, you're going to have build it. Lots of bad stuff happens until something really cool happens. That's your instigating incident. Then, nothing but positive, and then you're going to hit a climax where it all falls apart, and by the end of the comic, the world's destroyed. Either figuratively or actually. On the other hand, if you want to have it end on a slightly more upbeat note, flip it around. Lots of lots of good stuff happens. Instigating incident where it all falls apart and keeps falling apart for a little while. Then all of a sudden it comes back together in the climax, and you end up with a denouement where everybody gets the rewards. The bad guys get punished, the good guys get whatever they wanted, and the world is saved, or at least not blown up. You notice how, by the way, we placed the two? In a positive movie, the instigating incident is where it blows apart, whereas in the positive one, the instigating incident is where everything... let me reverse that. I knew I was going to screw that up somewhere. In the negative movie, your instigating incident is essentially where everything comes together. On the other hand, instigating incident in a positive movie is where everything falls apart. When you hit the climax, that gets reversed. In a negative movie, everything falls apart, whereas in a positive movie, and it's comic, everything basically starts coming together. I told you I was going to screw up comic and movie a couple of times. Like I said, there's a lot of similarities when it comes. So, you're going to want to throw in at least 2 plots. The romantic is pretty much a default. Having characters build up, get a little bit better, training, montages, that sort of thing. Technically, that's all subplot. Again, if it's important to the main plot, it's a main plot. If it's not important to the main plot, but it's still an important thread that has to happen, even if it runs parallel to the main plot, it's a subplot. And of course, you have these cute little running gags that are basically just you as a writer just having a little bit of fun. You can poke fun at the story. You can have characters just doing weird things just to see what the characters can do, that sort of thing. Every character should have a chance in the spotlight. Running gags give, your tertiary characters a chance to do exactly that. So, yeah, if you get all that stuff straight, you'll be ready for when we start having a little bit of fun with it. That's the basics of plotting. And, real quick, that list of books I gave you at the beginning, Stan Lee's How to Draw Comics, Scott McCloud, Understanding Comics, Blake Snyder, Save the Cat, Champions 4th Edition Superhero Rules, and of course, Joseph Campbell's The Hero's Journey. If you can find the one that's basically a transcript of him with Bill Moyer, I believe it is, so much the better. So, with that, track those books down, read them, and have a good evening. Talk at you later.